Never mind the King's speech. What about Congressman Peter King's brain? In our number one story, the impeccable British actor Colin Firth, the star of the film The King's Speech, and we're proud to say Countdown viewer as well, was asked by the BBC to program one of its radio news shows. So he asked a BBC reporter to determine what physically makes conservatives and liberals think the way they do. The results seem to provide physical evidence for all of the behavioral studies John Dean wrote about in his 2006 book, Conservatives Without Conscience. John joins me presently. Last week, Mr. Firth, the eminently socially conscious star of The King's Speech, was given editorial control of BBC Radio 4's news show, the Today program. It's different than ours. It has an M and an E at the end. And he assigned what he originally deemed a frivolous exercise to a BBC reporter.
I just decided to find out what was biologically wrong with people who don't agree with me, and see what scientists had to say about it. And they actually came up with something.
Yeah, the BBC, in fact, used the University College London's Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience to perform brain scans on two British MPs, one from Labour, Stephen Pound, and one from the Conservative Party, Alan Duncan. Scientists matched the politicians' results with the brain scans of Conservative and Liberal college students who had previously been subjected to MRIs. What was discovered has been deemed significant and very surprising. According to the study, brains of self-described Conservatives generally have larger right amygdalae, a primitive lobe in the brain associated with emotions and processing fear. Brains of liberals have larger anterior cingulates, described as, quote, an area at the front of the brain associated with courage and looking on the bright side of life. That's right. My anterior cingulates are huge. Quoting Professor Geraint Rees, there is something about political attitude that is encoded in our brain structure. He's Welsh. Through our experience, or that there is something in our brain structure that determines our results' political attitude. Then again, this is a British study. What about American conservatives? Do they also have bigger fear processing centers? As you watch the following clip, and I understand this is not completely scientific, see if you spot any enlarged amygdalae.
I fear that radical Muslims who want to control the Middle East and ultimately the world would love to see In God We Trust stricken from our money.
I worry a lot that they're using the current set of economic difficulties to try to justify a massive expansion in the government.
I and my staff, I think, spend most of our time afraid.
I think people should be afraid.
You actually used the phrase, I fear for our democracy.
I fear for our democracy.
The reason why gold broke to all-time highs, fear.
Rudy Giuliani, there's only three things he mentioned in a sentence, a noun and a verb and 9/11. I mean, there's nothing else.
Joining us now, a man whose amygdala is not showing, John Dean, former White House counsel and author of the 2006 book, Conservatives Without Conscience. John, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
This sounds like a video version, an MRI version, if you will, of Conservatives Without Conscience. Does this little tiny accidental BBC-inspired Colin Firth-related study jibe with the studies that you wrote about?
Well, in some ways it does, but not knowing an amygdala, if it was sitting on my head, and one is sitting on my head, I thought I had to talk to somebody who actually knew something about this. So I called the man I drew on his work greatly when writing Conservatives Without Conscience, Robert Altmaier, who at the time was up at the University of Manitoba. And I drew his attention to this study to see for his reaction. And he said, you know, John, I have some troubles with this. He said first, you know, there's some real basic problems with the way the amygdala works. He described to me what I thought was important is it's the wiring in it, and it doesn't really much depend on the size, but rather the way the wiring, if you will, fires and makes the system operate. The other thing is the sample is very small, right. And that's one of the problems. But we also know this isn't the end of the sample, and apparently those who've undertaken this study are going to keep browsing and take this further because it is kind of interesting.
The researchers are, to some degree, admitting one of the points that you just made. Certainly, they can't tell if the fear center, the right amygdala, is born that way or can be shaped or damaged that way, or particularly shaped. The behavioral studies that you quoted in the book, did they indicate whether people are born with some sort of predilection or are shaped into these sort of political or even cultural or just view of humanity poles, liberal and conservative?
Well, there's some of both. It's both the nature and the nurture situation. One of the things Oltmeier, for example, told me is he said in his testing of authoritarian children, one of the things they report is that their parents taught them to be frightful. Mm-hmm. Those parents, we don't know if they were taught by the same by their parents, but this is one of the factors. In the testing that I looked at, and I looked at an awful lot of social studies and behavioral studies of great masses of people. In fact, one of the studies by an NYU professor, John Jost, and his colleagues, they looked at 40 years of studies of the personalities of conservatives. It was some 22,000 participants, and they found clearly that fear is a part of the makeup of the personality of the conservative. This is part of the psychological makeup. This isn't necessarily a pathological judgment. It is just an analysis of the type of person we're dealing with. So I think it's a real factor, and it's one that conservatives don't necessarily want to hear, but it is what the way they certainly test repeatedly and consistently.
Is it, I think one of the points of your book was that this is now conservative versus liberal, but it wasn't, that essentially Republicans and conservatives co-opted a personality trait, that this is really a question of authoritarian personality versus non-authoritarian personality. Is that about the right synopsis?
Well, that's what I drew out of a lot of the social science, and that was, of course, the theme of the book, that the conservative without conscience is the most extreme of the authoritarian personality types, where they could care less about any sort of human compassion or any kind of concern for their fellow man. They're fairly selfish. They're fairly self-centered. They're very domineering. They're the people who jump out in front and say, "Follow me," whether they really know what they're doing or not, but they just want to be out there. So there are those personalities that have come to dominate the conservative movement, and we're going to see them in Washington starting this week. They're there.
Testing our apparent biological predilection towards optimism, which I'm not believing at the moment as well. John Dean, former White House counsel under President Nixon and the author of Conservatives Without Conscience, which is really an eye-opener if you still haven't read it. As always, John, a great pleasure. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Keith.
That's January 3rd, 28 days since the Republicans got the tax deal for riches, taxes for the rich. Mr. Boehner, where are the jobs? And Keith Olbermann, good night and good luck. And now to discuss why he believes the Republicans are bluffing on the debt ceiling, in for Rachel tonight, it's Chris Hayes. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, Keith. Thanks so much. Rachel's got the night off, and thus here I am to steer the ship in her absence. And tonight it is a show with a whole lot of freight.